When a dog breeder and her elderly mother were murdered in their own home in an isolated country cottage in Upwell, Norfolk, two big questions loomed over the case. Who and why? This is the case of Janice and Connie Sheridan. It was 1999. 45-year-old Janice Sheridan lived with her mother, 79-year-old Connie Sheridan, at their country home in Upwell, Norfolk. The pair led a very isolated life. The home was kind of in the middle of nowhere, and around was fields and trees. The pair bred dogs, mainly whippets, and spent every waking moment tending to them. The dogs were Jan's life, her passion. Her mother Connie was getting older, and at 79 her legs were not as they were. She often felt quite weak and shaky and needed to sit down. They had moved into the country house about 8 years previously and initially did not have much to do with their neighbours. Until 3 years previously, a break-in occurred where youths broke in, letting all the dogs out. And this was the point where Connie and her daughter started becoming close to the neighbours. It was important that the families both kept an eye out for each other, for anyone hanging around. They often chatted and became firm friends with their neighbour, another elderly lady. She would often save up old newspapers in a pile for the dogs. So she would call Connie up and Jan would appear at the door to pick them up. They came in useful for the dog kennels outside. Outside the back of the cottage, they had made kennels and bred dogs. The road that led up to the Sheridan's house was a single track. It rarely had any traffic on it, as Connie and Jan were very quiet people. And unless they had a delivery of dog food, it was very rare to see anyone on that road. A farmer at the bottom of the track was doing some work when he saw a car go past as if it was driving up the lane. He was very aware of any unusual vehicles passing by, as he had had problems with theft of vehicles, bits of machinery going missing over the years, and the farmer assumed that the driver was just maybe lost and would return down the lane soon. But when he did not see the car reappear, he went to take a closer look. He drove up the lane and saw a pale-coloured car parked right next to Connie and Jan's house. The farmer took a note of the registration number of the car. Now at 10 a.m. on Thursday the 7th of Jan, a fisherman seen Jan walk past with a huddle of whippets. They called her the Whippet Lady. That Thursday afternoon at 4:15, Jan was seen out and about in town. It was presumed that after this she went home. Now the next morning on Friday the 8th of Jan, the bin men arrived to pick up the rubbish. Although unusually, neither of the bins were outside for collection. The bin men reported that this was the first time that this had ever happened. On the Saturday morning, Jan would usually collect a magazine for her neighbour called Dog's World and take it over for her, although the neighbour felt it was odd when it never arrived. The neighbour rang Connie and Jan's house, but it went straight to answer phone. At about midday on Saturday the 9th, the neighbour was being picked up by friends to go out for the day. As she drove past Connie and Jan's house, the neighbour noticed that the curtains were still partially closed. The dogs were barking and whining. It was quite unusual, but the neighbour just told herself she was worried about nothing. On Saturday evening, after the neighbour returned home from visiting friends, she noticed that the lights were on at the back of Connie and Jan's house and the light on in the kitchen. Now this made the neighbour feel a little better, but on Sunday the 10th of January something even more unusual happened. Jan, who had a job at a nearby farm, she worked there as they had kennels looking after dogs. It was her dream job. But when she did not turn up to work, it was really unlike her. Jan loved her job. She was one of the most reliable people working there. And Jan was always there on the dot, never been sick. And if she had have been, then she would have rung in, but nothing. So the lady who owned the farm/kennels decided to drive over to Jan and Connie's farm to see if they were okay. Now when the farm kennel lady turned up, The first thing she noticed was the barking and whining of the dogs. Now she knew straight away that the barking and whining was not right. She had dogs over there at kennels, and she knew that they sounded unsettled, not happy, maybe hungry. She knocked on the doors, but no one answered, and she started pounding on the windows too. But still, no one answered. It was quiet apart from the sound of the dogs, and no one came to the doors. The curtains were still partially drawn. With no reply, the farm kennel lady jumped back in her car and drove round to the neighbour's house. She told her of her concerns over Jan and how she'd not turned up for work. Straight away, the worries that the neighbour had felt the previous day came back to the forefront. She knew deep down something was wrong, but now the worries were confirmed by someone else. Worried that something had happened to Connie and Jan, they decided that they needed to do something. The neighbour ran into her house and called the police. As the farm/kennel lady went back to the house and managed to open the side gate, running down the passageway to the back door. Again they knocked, but again nothing. The door was unlocked as they gently opened the door a crack. But the smell hit them straight away. Whatever had gone on in there was far worse than they had imagined, and none of them wanted to explore further. The smell was enough to stop them in their tracks. Waiting now for police left them time to consider the worst-case scenarios. It was not long before police arrived at the scene, and as they opened the door it was already several days since anyone had seen the pair. Connie and Jan were found in the living room of their home. Jan was found surrounded by 20 whippets. She was lying on the floor, on her back, with her legs bound at the ankles with some kind of duct tape, resting on a chair. Her upper chest and thighs were exposed, and Connie had been placed on the sofa with her arms crossed over her chest. It was soon determined that police constables needed far more help than they already had. Calling for scenes of crime, and detectives arrived at the address. The area was cordoned off and police went house to house, taking statements from anyone who'd seen anything suspicious. This was now a murder inquiry and everyone needed to be spoken to. The farmer down the lane had the best information. He told police about the car that he'd seen parked outside Connie and Jan's house. Police were even more surprised and even a little excited by the fact that this man had taken the registration for them. The head of Norfolk CID, Steve Swain, said a full-scale murder investigation had been launched, involving more than 30 officers. This was a callous and ruthless attack on two defenseless women. He said that it had been carried out by a sharp kitchen instrument, probably the same instrument that was used on both women. It was carried out in a ruthless manner by a determined person or persons. Forensics were soon examining the scene, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fibres and swabbing blood droplets, looking for anything that they could use to test for DNA, hoping to find this perpetrator. Although they were struggling to establish an exact time of death, police were also baffled trying to determine a motive. There were no obvious signs of a break-in. The two women had had a burglary 3 years previously, but they were investigating to see if the two incidents could be connected. Mr. Swain added that it was possible that the two women had known the perpetrator or even had let them into the house.
More than 70 police officers are involved in the hunt for the killer of widow Connie Sheridan and her 45-year-old daughter Janice, known locally for breeding whippets. They'd been repeatedly and were found in the lounge of their house at Upwell on Sunday lunchtime.
The Fenlands cottage where the Sheridans were murdered is so remote no one would have heard their cries for help.
Officers were told by neighbours that apparently Jan Sheridan had publicly been opposing plans to allow travellers to move into their Fenland village. So police had plans to question travellers and campaigners behind the scene to see if they could shed any light on the deaths. Jan Sheridan was not married. She lived with her mother. She was a prize-winning whippet breeder. She'd been a whippet breeder for more than 15 years and was well known among the dog breeders in the area. The East Anglian Whippet Club said that they were stunned by the news of her death.
This weekend, the murder inquiry moved to Crufts at Birmingham. Four detectives from Norfolk Police spoke to dog owners and breeders who may have known the Sheridans. It should have been Janice Sheridan at Crufts instead of the detectives, but the dog she had bred did her proud.
Detectives started making inquiries to see whether the attack might be linked to the woman's involvement in the dog breeding world. However, none of the dogs that were found at the home were injured in the attack, and police appealed for members of the public to come forward with any information that they felt relevant. They said that they were particularly interested in hearing about anyone who maybe arrived home covered in blood that night, bitten by a dog, or whose vehicle might have contained bloodstains. Police even went to Crime Watch at the BBC to create a reconstruction of the crime, hoping that somebody may ring in with vital information.
They lived on the outskirts of the village of Upwell, breeding whippets. Connie and her daughter lived a fairly isolated life.
A witness had told police about the registration number of the suspicious car parked outside the Sheridan's cottage, so police looked into who it could be. Initially, it did not match any cars on the register, until police believed that maybe if they just looked closer, maybe the man had just misread one of the letters, so police looked into this. Another witness also remembered seeing a similar light-coloured car driving away from the house. The man would apparently be wearing a bobby ball wig whilst driving. Now, fingerprints were found at the scene, now had a match on the database. It was a man named Kevin Cottrell, so police were quick to track this man down, and he was questioned for hours. But they also got a warrant to search his home, where they retrieved some of his footwear. At the scene, forensics had been able to pull his fingerprints, but also a boot print. A boot print found at the scene was a match to one of Kevin's boots, found in his house. Police took Kevin's DNA on arrest, and when forensics had swabbed the wounds of the victims, they had not only found the DNA of Connie and Jan, but they'd also found foreign DNA, also possibly the DNA of the perpetrator, and what a surprise, Kevin's DNA was in the wounds of Janice and Connie, placing him firmly at the scene during the murders. When Kevin was interviewed by police, he admitted to meeting Janice and Connie back in 1998, when he was working for a home improvement firm. Kevin Cottrell had been a former door-to-door salesman. He told police that he had sold them a window, but had never been back to the house again since. Detectives had no idea what the motive was. They said that it was probably SA related. Kevin had 2 convictions for house burglaries back in 1983. Detectives said that there was evidence to suggest that he had an obsession with a teenage girl that also lived in one of the houses, but police felt now that they had enough to charge Kevin. And in court, Graham Parkins, QC for Kevin Cottrell, said, "In answer to the question why, I cannot provide anything at all." Passing the sentence, Mr. Justice Owen said, "These are terrible and terrifying offences. How they came to be committed is not clear, but that they were committed by you is abundantly clear. There is only one sentence." He was jailed for a full life order. Kevin pleaded guilty. The family were devastated. "We just want to know why," they said. "We just want to know why. We were hoping that we might get some answers during the trial, but we still don't know why he did what he did. The last year has been unimaginable."